The failure of the church. As those who profess to be members of Christ's family today, we must be on guard against the same sins that God condemned in Israel. Here's Gene.
Here in chapter 5, Isaiah pronounces a series of woes on Judah. In 5:20, he says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." And there he's being very literal. But then he follows that with metaphors that are pretty graphic. Who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And of course, that describes Judah as Isaiah is prophesying the words of the Lord. In 21 and 23, woe to those who are wise in their own opinion and clever in their own sight. What a statement that is. I mean, that's a proverb, really. Woe to those who are wise in their own opinion and clever in their own sight. And that, of course, describes exactly what was happening, particularly to the leaders in Israel, including some of the kings. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine, who are fearless at mixing beer, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of justice. And of course, here he's talking about drunkenness. People that are absolutely out of control in their immorality and all the things that are doing, the injustice towards the poor and others that they should be caring for rather than making them victims of their evil deeds. So here we have this series of woes. Now, it's interesting that judgment came as a result of these statements, as a result of their behavior. The prophecies were fulfilled. They were taken into Babylonian captivity. But these woes are repeated in relationship to Israel by Jesus Christ himself. So if you go to Matthew, look at what we read. And these are the words of Jesus. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And he goes on there in verses 14, 23, 25, 27, 29, basically saying the same thing. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, and explains why. Very, very strong statements, very similar to what Isaiah did here in this Old Testament book. And the conclusion are Jesus' words of judgment. Snakes, brood of vipers. That doesn't sound too much like the gentle Jesus, does it? But the gentle Jesus, in a sense, is saying, what more could I do? What more could I do? See, God has patience. Patience, and that's why Jesus hadn't come, that all will respond, that all will come to knowledge of the truth. But he's a holy God. And so he says, snakes, brood of vipers, how can you escape being condemned to hell? This is why I'm sending you prophets, sages, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Fascinating thing is, that's what happened basically to Stephen when he was stoned, he was killed. That's what happened to Peter, who was probably crucified upside down. That's what happened to the Apostle Paul, who was probably beheaded by Nero. And the irony is that the Apostle Paul himself, when he was still called Saul, was one of those who killed and put people in prison. And that's why Paul never got over the grace of God in calling him to be the great apostle to the Gentiles. He just never got over that grace and that mercy. And so Jesus said, some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and hound from town to town. Someday we can talk to the Apostle Paul about the number of times he was flogged because of his commitment to Jesus Christ in the synagogues, beaten with rods because of his faith and what he was preaching about God's grace and his mercy. Now, going ahead to the end of the story, again in Revelation, when Jesus appeared to John on the Isle of Patmos, he addressed the sins in the churches of Asia. And if you can imagine, they're were churches that came into existence because of Paul's ministry in Ephesus. For 2 years, he ministered in the school. He taught. People came from all over Asia. They came from cities like Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira and Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. And those are the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. And if you can imagine, Ephesus is like a circle in that list. The churches of Asia. Some of us had the privilege of going to modern Turkey, where they're excavating a number of those cities and identifying where those churches existed. It's a fascinating, fascinating experience. But as you look at these churches, you will see that Jesus Christ dealt with them and disciplined them because of their sins as believers or professed believers. One of the worst was the church in Thyatira. And Jesus didn't mince any words when he talked about their sins and their evil, and he uses an Old Testament graphic illustration. When he says this, "But I have this against you, you tolerate the woman Jezebel." And if they knew Jewish history, which they certainly probably did or should have been taught, they would know who Jezebel is. She was the wife of Ahab, who was a king in Israel, one of the most wicked kings. He's the one that Elijah confronted up on the mountain, and where the fire came down, and the prophets of Baal ultimately were destroyed. She had her own prophets. She rebelled. She wouldn't even bring those prophets, her prophets of Asherah, up to that mountain. She was a very wicked, evil woman. She's a symbol of immorality, and you see it here. You tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and teaches and deceives my slaves to commit sexual immorality and to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Now, we don't know who this person was, but Jesus identified her as a Jezebel, a prophetess who claimed to be the truth where she was teaching evil. But notice God's mercy. Jesus said, "I gave her time to repent, but she does not want to repent of her sexual immorality." And of course, if you know the story of Jezebel, she had opportunities to repent. She saw the judgments that came on those prophets. She saw what God did through disobedience. But she refused right up to the very end and suffered a horrible death because of her sin. "Look," Jesus said, "I will throw her into a sick bed and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation unless they repent of her practices." And if you know anything about the Old Testament story, she was thrown from a window above and into the streets where her body was literally eaten by the dogs. It's a horrible story. But you can see the imagery here and how Jesus is using this Old Testament illustration to illustrate the sins of the church. "I will kill her children with the plague, then all the churches will know that I am the one who examines minds and hearts, and I will give to each of you according to your works." In other words, Jesus said, if you repent, you experience my mercy. Thank God for his mercy that extends to all sin, no matter what we do. But in order to experience that, we need to respond to his grace. Israel did not respond. And this New Testament church in Thyatira did not respond. By the 2nd century, it had disappeared. See, there's no guarantee that a church that is alive and well and strong will endure unless we're faithful to the Lord. And all of these churches disappeared off the scene, even the church of Ephesus, because of their sins. So there are great lessons that we can learn, and if you want to go in the Life Essential Study Bible to the book of Revelation, where we deal with these churches and the principles that grow out of each of these illustrations, it's a powerful, powerful story of Jesus Christ as he addressed the leaders, particularly of these churches. So here's a reflection and response question. Why do many church leaders avoid administering discipline to members who are seriously living out of the will of God? As I thought about that question myself, I thought, it's no fun. It's tough. You might be rejected. Chances are you will be rejected. And yet, it is one of the responsibilities that we have, particularly as spiritual leaders. We have a responsibility to each other, but particularly as spiritual leaders, we have a responsibility to deal with the sins of people who are walking out of the will of God, who are part of the family of God. And it's difficult to discover, particularly in our culture today, because it's very easy to hide in the crowd. And that's why it's so important, I think, to have structures in our church where people who claim to be believers will surface, who are walking out of the will of God, so that lovingly we can admonish them and encourage them. That's step number one, is to reach out, encourage, and love and build them before they reach a state of, in some cases, almost no return. And sometimes we find out about these situations in people's lives when all the damage is done. Some things are beyond our control. I think some things are within our control if the church is functioning as God intended it to function. As I reflect back on my own experience as a pastor for a number of years, some of the most disappointing experiences I've had are in confronting people lovingly, as much as I could, and have them say, thanks, but no thanks, and simply walk away. That's very disappointing. But some of the most glorious experiences, I wish there were more of them, but are those who respond and who say, thank you. Thank you that you didn't let me go. Thank you that you pursued me. Thank you that you reached out. And here's a beautiful verse from Galatians that gives us a process. I've called it biblical intervention. Brothers, if someone is caught in any wrongdoing or trapped in sin, it's a functional description of addiction. You who are spiritual, and that's a very important point. You plural, that's a plural pronoun, because this is a task for more than one individual. You who are spiritual. And it's interesting that in chapter 5, just above it, he's described people who are walking in the Spirit versus those who are walking in the flesh. And he's saying to restore others is not someone who is still walking in the flesh themselves and trying to restore somebody else. But you who are spiritual, you who are walking in the Spirit, should restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so you also won't be tempted. And believe me, that's the gentle Jesus. That's the Jesus that walks the pages of the Gospels. But there comes an end, of course, where in essence he's saying what he said through Isaiah, what more can I do? But here, Paul says, we should watch ourselves so we won't be tempted, carry one another's burdens, and this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. So here's the principle to live by. As those who profess to be members of Christ's family today, we must be on guard against the same sins that God condemned in Israel.